listener production.
I'm automotive commentator and journalist Greg Rust, and this is Rusty's Garage. I'm in Singapore for this episode. It's the day after the F1 night race, and I'm catching up with Michael Masi on the 37th floor of a hotel by the track. His story is a good one, and it's not widely known. An Aussie who now has one of the most important jobs in world motorsport, in a game that is filled with egos and intense politics. You'd be forgiven for thinking, wow, he's suddenly burst on the scene. But it's no overnight success story. Masi is one of the hardest working people I know. Incredibly thorough, big on detail, and widely respected, especially by the old guard. The role of Formula One race director came about at the beginning of the 2019 season, following the sudden passing of Charlie Whiting just days before the Australian Grand Prix. Whiting was part of the fabric of F1, much loved, and he'd been in the job for decades. Incredibly tough circumstances to get the call up, but Charlie, among others, had taken him under his wing, and Masi's diverse apprenticeship included the GP feeder categories Formula 3 and Formula 2. Australian motorsport is rightly proud of what Michael's achieved. He really has come a long way from the suburbs of Sydney.
Grew up in Western Sydney, and probably the type of cars varied from around where I was. It was very much the, let's call it the old Australian muscle to a degree. Is probably
What are we talking, Kingswoods and Tiranas?
We're talking Kingswoods, Tiranas, XC Falcons and, GT HOs and things like that. And then from the other side, sort of the aspirational cars of looking at Ferraris and Lamborghinis and the sort.
So I wanted to expand on the aspirational stuff because your uncle Rudy runs Piccola Scuderia.
Certainly did.
Fitzroy Street in Marrickville. Tim Jardine, a mutual friend of ours who's a producer in motorsport television, reminded me while we were here that he said it feels a bit like a Maranello mechanic workshop when you go in there. There's sort of an older style one with Alfas and Ferraris and things like that. Just describe it and how often you would go in there and things like that.
Yeah, certainly. So that was when it existed at the time, it's no longer around. But it was very much an old school workshop. My uncle Rudolph was an amazing mechanic, and I was going in there doing all the administrative side of things. Side of it, these hands aren't mechanics' hands. I'll be the first to admit, probably like yours. And so I was in there every day doing the administrative side of that business after I finished school and while I was still at college, and. Yeah, it was good. It was very much the old school little workshop. And yes, Tim Jardine used to come in probably every couple of weeks and sit down around in the lunchroom with the boys, and we used to have a hamburger and chips and solve the problems of the world.
He remembers that fondly. You've ultimately ended up in Formula One, the dream for many people. We'll chart more of your career as we go in this discussion, but what was your first F1 experience, even if it was as a little tacker? Can you tell me where you were?
100%. I remember it fondly. Was Adelaide 1992, the Adelaide Grand Prix, and finished my school exams. And Mum, as a surprise, said, right, we're going to Adelaide for the Grand Prix. So I literally finished my exams at school that day, and off we went to Adelaide.
You flew, you drove, what'd you do?
No, it was a bit of a mixture. So Mum and my late grandfather, drove to Griffith to break up the trip with a family friend of ours at the time. So the three of them went in the car, and because effectively timing-wise, I ended up getting on a little egg beater aircraft to fly from Sydney to to Griffith to meet them there, and we had family there, so we stayed there for the night and then drove from Griffith to Adelaide and stayed with family in Adelaide for the event.
Yep.
And remember it fondly, sitting at the end of the Bratham Straight, right at what is now turn 9 in the supercars event, left-hand side in the grandstand, watching the Adelaide Grand Prix and having grandstand passes, doing pit walks in the morning and things like that.
You remember being in awe of the cars and perhaps the drivers?
Was absolutely in awe of the cars, the drivers, the event, the noise. I remember having a Sega Game Gear at the time with the television tuner, because you couldn't actually, big screens weren't as sort of prominent, let's call it, back then. Yeah. So sitting there in my grandstand seat and watch the cars go by, and then you've got your little portable television at the time, which now seems antiquated, to watch what was going on and keep on track what was happening with the rest of the event. So, I was very, very fortunate that I have always had the amazing support of my mother, and that was sort of the real first Formula One experience.
She was there with you at a very important event at Albert Park this year, I know, and she's a great supporter. Kelvin O'Reilly, former boss of Super Touring in Australia and a long-time successful motorsport administrator who we both know heads up Karting Australia these days. He recalls this pesty kid around 1995, 1996. I think you might have still been at school. And I think you had this dream of trying to put together a 2-car alpha team in Super Touring. And he reckons at about 3:30 most afternoons after school would wrap up, the call had come through, you had all sorts of questions. How close did you get to stitching that dream together, and what were you endeavouring to do? Were they cars that Gabriele Tarquini had run in the British Championship, and what were you doing?
So basically it stemmed from my uncle having started his workshop, and yes, I was still at school. The aim at that point, I think it winds back to the start of 1995, where, scarily, shows how long I've been around, that I recall you being a pit lane commentator at the first round of the Australian Manufacturers Championship at Eastern Creek, now Sydney Motorsport Park.
Wearing a crook jacket and tie, probably.
Wearing a crook jacket and tie for that first event, which was effectively the advent of what was ultimately Super Touring in Australia. And together with my uncle was doing some work for one of the teams at the time, which was Peter Hills with the Ford Sierra, and had started his workshop, and it's like, I think we can do something here. So it was sort of, the height of Super Touring, particularly the British Touring Car Championship under Alan Gower's stewardship. It's like, let's try and make something happen here. So I was, I think, off air, Kelvin and others might describe me a little bit differently, but I think pesty little kid from school, and yeah, I was just...
You meant that in a term of endearment. I reckon in an entrepreneurial way. He was really impressed that this young teenager had this vision and was endeavouring to stitch this thing together.
No, absolutely, and it was sort of meeting different people at the events. The events that were in Sydney at the time, because 95 I was in year 11 at school, so second last year of school, and yeah, it was sort of trying to endeavour to keep pushing and having a look. I remember doing, on be it school days off or student free days and bits and pieces, going to sponsorship meetings and the like and putting together sponsorship proposals and all of that element, even through 96, to be honest, which was my last year of school. And yeah, when the Alfa Romeo side of it didn't quite come together, and that included the likes of another mutual friend of ours in Peter Adderton, and going through the promotional partners in North Sydney at the time. And I was very, very lucky to meet all of those different people. Ultimately, none of that occurred, but meeting effectively Kelvin and Barbara at the time, who have and still are very dear, lifelong friends. I call them my Gold Coast family to a degree.
When we were chatting for this, he more or less welled up. I think he thinks of you a bit like a another son for him. I mean, you lived in the house for a few years and worked out of the office there in an admin sense. I want to get to that. What I'm intrigued about at the moment is that on either the sponsorship chasing side or working in almost a kind of gopher capacity when you were a youngster 100%. There, you know, setting up the scales in pit lane and working with teams and things like that. You made yourself an invaluable part of the framework. You'd probably argue that no one's indispensable, I know, in your mind, but you did. Everyone would go, oh, Michael does that. Oh, Michael does that, you know, and so it would go. Unlike a lot of kids, though, who probably dream of being Lewis Hamilton or whatever, you had obviously in your mind thought you wanted to either get into the administration or the business side of the game at a young age, did you?
Yeah, so going back, I originally thought, once upon a time, I've always obviously had a passion for motorsport from a young age, and loved it. But I originally thought, funnily enough, that I actually wanted to be a chef. Yeah, quite. And then my mother was working in a Lasanne's restaurant in Sydney, in Brighton, which at the time was a beautiful restaurant and magic location on the beachfront there. And so I was doing some waitering on weekends, effectively, as any 15, 16-year-old kid does to earn a bit of pocket money. And very quickly worked out, having seen the boys in the kitchen, that I enjoy cooking for my own personal well-being and not for hundreds of people a night. So that thought very quickly went out the window. And actually, my original part was I thought I wanted to be an engineer because at that point, well, motorsport, the only pathway in is to work on a car. Yeah. And the family side of it, of working on cars, so I thought that's where I want to go. And very quickly realised at school that physics and chemistry were not my forte. So from there, morphed into, had a look, and Kelvin, to be honest, was a key influencer in this, in saying, well, there's more paths than just the engineering side. There's the businessy side, and I really enjoyed the marketing and promotional elements. And yeah, once I finished school in '96, I did Asia Pacific marketing at TAFE. Mm-hmm. And because there was the only event management courses at that time was at UTS in Sydney, if I recall correctly, and you effectively needed doctor's marks in the HSC, which were in the late 90s, and that wasn't me. So the only course that was the equivalent at that point was a sort of a marketing and promotion course. I did Asia Pacific marketing at Meadowbank TAFE in Sydney. Fantastic. And which worked out extremely well, because it was a 4-day-a-week course, so Monday to Thursday. Mondays didn't start until the afternoon. Thursdays finished at midday, so it didn't impinge on the voluntary side of what I was doing in super touring with the Ford Mondeos at the time, that I could effectively go to the events, do what I did, and it was a fully voluntary capacity. Yes, my flights and that got paid for and accommodation at the time, but as a 17, 18-year-old kid, it was for the passion of it and learning and meeting different people. And I was very fortunate, and in this business, and I think you and most others will agree, the people that you meet and the spectrum of people that you meet from all walks of life is amazing. So, I was fortunate enough even here to catch up with Terry and Lurleen Morris for breakfast, and Terry was, absolutely, he was the chairman of TOCA Australia, obviously better known as Paul Morris's dad, but, between Terry and Peter Adderton at the time, with Kelvin as the CEO, the three of them, I would say, were huge supporters in those early years, which led to ultimately at the end of 1998, working with TOCA, because I had become that much of a pest, to put it in Kelvin's words, that they offered me a job. So my first event with TOCA Australia was actually the Macau event, where I think 8 or 9 super touring car teams from Australia came to do the Macau gear race, which was all of the super touring cars from around the world. And I'd I met a gentleman by the name of Max Kingston, who was at Ansett at the time, and negotiated a significantly discounted deal for all the Australian teams, to go to Macau.
Amazing, mate. We've actually just uncovered a little something that you and I share. We've gone completely different paths in motor racing. You went to Meadowbank and did, for international people listening to the podcast here, think of TAFE like college, I guess, in some respects.
Yes.
I did a similar marketing course, not Asia Pacific orientated. You were at Meadowbank. I was about 15 k's up the road in the Hills District doing a similar thing. I'm a little bit older than you, but we have gone on to different paths. I want to get to the admin stuff a bit more in a moment, but let's finish up a bit on that early race team, if you like, involvement. Firstly, you mentioned the Ford Mondeos there before. Were they ex-Andy Rouse cars? Can you recall, was it a car perhaps raced by Paul Radisich? What was the history on that one?
Yeah, there was the Mondeo, so in those days were, they were actually ultimately all Andy Rouse cars early on, and those cars then went to America for the North American Touring Car Championship, or Super Touring Car Championship, and Peter purchased the three of those in the, let's call it, older style Mondeo look. And for 1999, I think it was, that they got facelifted, let's call it, into the more modern look, and which was, there was ex-Paul Radisich World Touring Car Cup at the time, I think it was, that won. So those cars had some amazing history behind them. And I even remember the internationals at Bathurst during the Bathurst 1000, when it was in the Super Touring days, looking at them saying, because they were in the new shape, saying, hold on, these cars have got the front engine V's. These cars just don't look like what we built but when it transferred from Rouse's to West Surrey Racing. And that was because it was effectively the hybrid version. But, that was a good, fun time and very grounding. I met some amazing characters working with likes of John Patchos and Barrel, as he's affectionately referred to, and met some really cool people along the way.
From an open wheeler perspective as well, if memory serves, did Rudy not have a Formula 3 team? And I reckon Peter Hackett drove for you guys at one stage too, didn't he?
Yep, we so with the Toka side of it, when I was working with them, that was a part-time basis. So I was actually based out of my uncle's workshop in Sydney, which is where I did his administrative side of it, as well as working for Toka on a contract basis.
Amazing.
And we ultimately, once the whole Alfa Romeo, and then, at one point, Ferrari team, which were trying to set up the similar sort of time, was sort of the two consecutive projects with running a 355 Ferrari in the Australian GT Production Championship under Ross Palmer's guys. And it was like, okay, haven't got the finances for that. So then in, I think it was 98, 99, really, we ended up getting a Formula 3 car, and Peter Hackett came to, sort of got to meet Peter early on, and Peter drove for us, and we did a let's call it a shortened program in 1999 for when he had the budget to do it. And through 1999, he met Betty Klemenko and Daniel, if I recall correctly, at a Porsche driver training day, and they got on extremely well, to the point that the last round, Betty came out, which was the first time that I'd met Betty at the time. And I think Betty will recall this one vividly, as do I, that the two of us were sitting on the steps of our trailer, devouring a bucket of KFC chicken at the time. And, we've, still get on extremely well to this day. Betty and Daniel are amazing people, and, now the owners of Erebus. But at the time it was the Cactus Group that was on the Formula 3 car, and ultimately we won the inaugural Australian Formula 3 Championship with Peter in 2000. And then that team went on for another 3 or 4 years, and that was sort of what I would argue was the strength of Formula 3 in Australia. Yes, it was a generation behind what England and so forth was running, but it was built in that way. And yeah, there was a strong rivalry between us at Pickler Scuderia. There was, BRM, Bronte Rundle, with Ian Richards there. We had Sam Astudillo, all those guys. And, there was 22 cars of the day, and sort of that front pack of 10 to 12 cars competing. And then there was the gentleman drivers who were literally there having fun and were great. And, yeah, another sort of career-defining moment, one could say.
So what was the point where you went full tilt? I love the team stuff. I enjoy being around the cars, but I can see my future being in the admin side. And can you recall that moment?
Yeah, it was probably doing the elements with TOCA up until TOCA effectively, or Super Touring in Australia, finished. And I quite enjoyed that side of it. So it was, they were all part-time jobs effectively that I was gelling together to try and earn a living.
Were you jack of all trades? Were you immersed in rule books? What were you? There was sponsorship stuff too, wasn't there?
Yeah, in those early days, it was very much sort of the sponsorship marketing elements that were a part of it. But TOCA in those days was hands-on. Mm. Everyone got into everything. We had the Amor brothers, Grant and Carl. We had Pete Greville, and it was a small team of people that did everything. There was no room for preciousness, let's put it that way. The only thing that we were 100% certain of is that when it came to packing up, we put Kelvin in a darkened room because he used to, that wasn't his forte. But no, from those sides, it was a rounded experience, is probably the best way to put it. And yeah, it was, from there, TOCA finished up, concentrated on the Pickler side of it, with Rudolph through 2001, continued doing some elements with Kelvin at times on different conferences and that he was running. And then when Kelvin started with Tiga, who was the 75% shareholder in Supercars, so the teams group at the time, he gave me a call, and we used to chat regularly anyway, and then we were chatting one day, and I said to him, well, if anything comes up or that we can work together with, let me know. And I think at the time he got the approval of the Tiga board to employ someone, because he had succeeded Wayne Katak, who was doing that dual role. And I think there were, if I recall correctly, it was Gary Rogers, Brad Jones were two of the board members at the time. Effectively gave him the budget to employ someone, and I moved from Sydney to the Gold Coast, and what was going to be a 6-month contract, and I ended up living up there for 6 years.
Amazing. So that, then opens the doors in some ways to the next level. You are dealing, I think when I spoke to Mark Scaife for this, he can fondly recall this period and some of the people that were on the Tiga board back then, and he sort of laughed and said, you want to talk politicians. I mean, there were some serious operators in Australian motorsport, and they all had different sort of ideas and agendas. It must have been quite an eye-opening thing for you, but one that clearly, maybe you were to begin with, I don't know, but one that you clearly weren't daunted by.
I think outwardly didn't look to be daunted by. Internally, very. But no, when I joined Tiga as as effectively the assistant to the GM, it was a wide varying role, and it was a time in effectively where the teams were looking after their part, the supercars side of it, and sitting in Tiga board meetings where effectively you're looking at some of them are your childhood heroes to a degree, be it Larry Perkins, Mark Scaife, had Mark Larkham sitting in there, then Ross Stone for a period. And, the list goes on, that here are people that, as a kid are legends of the sport, and sort of between on the phone to them for work purposes and that. And yeah, it was a defining moment, but also ultimately became a bit of a challenging one. And it's funny you mentioned Mark, is that obviously with the collapse of the Walkinshaw Empire at the time, and TIGA had what was established was the TIGA Tribunal, which was effectively the dispute resolution mechanism within the what was the team's licence agreement, now known as a REC, for commercial contractual purposes. And the three gentlemen that sat on that tribunal it was chaired by Gary Connolly, who's one of the Formula One permanent chairman, the FIA World Motorsport Council member for Australia. So Gary was the chairman. Bob Glindeman, who previously was heavily involved at Shell, and was also one of the directors, became a board member at CAMS and the vice president at the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, and Adrian Simons, who was a lawyer from Brisbane, and they were the three members of the TIGA Tribunal. And so my role sat as the secretary of that, and my first sort of real part with Mark came about in the whole investigation into the Walkinshaw Group collapse, and then the Holden intervention and so forth. And that was some tough times at that point, because that went on for probably probably a good 2 years, and getting the old legal letters at 5 to 5 on a Friday afternoon, the famous legal tack that took place. There was the HRT Holden Racing Team side of it with Mark. There was PWR with Keys Wheel, and there was the dealer team with John and Margaret Kelly at the time. And going through, doing that whole investigation, I can say Mark and I laugh about it now, and he even recalls it. I remember sending some very strongly worded letters assigned to me, but obviously it was part of, at the end of the day, it was part of my job. I was there in an administrative function, and they were protecting what they had to do.
I think both you and I have worked with him long enough to know that in those tough moments, because he is such a thorough, a competitive human being, that ironically in those tough moments, sometimes that's where you earn the greatest respect from him. And I think I can see that in your case. We won't delve too deeply into the Walkinshaw story, because I think people can find that if they want to and go back on it. But what I will share is a little fun moment in relation to it. And Kelvin says there was 2 years, he reckons, worth of work that you both did. You knew it intimately. He reckons that, even Mark says the same now, that your work ethic, mate, is remarkable. You'll often work 20-hour days to get it done. It's been a hallmark of who you are. But you rock up with 2 cases full of notes, I think it was, to the tribunal. I don't quite know the story here, but I think one of the lawyers wasn't articulating themselves too well. Kelvin kind of took the helm at one point, and someone rolled out the great Jack Nicholson line, didn't they? You can't handle the truth, or something like that.
They did. That was actually Kelvin rolled that one out on the very in the very last moments of the tribunal hearing that was taking place at Gary Connolly's office, funnily enough, in the boardroom there. It was 2 days. It was actually, I won't forget it, because it's how I spent my birthday, was sitting in a tribunal hearing that year. But yeah, Kelvin did roll that line out, which was like, you sort of had to take a moment and go, you did what? But no, it was, don't get me wrong, those times at that time were extremely full on for all of us. Including the 3 teams involved from a TIGA perspective. In those days, I would say that HRT was it was the team from all fronts, and it was pretty intense, because it soaked up 2 years of my life, in a large degree, as well as that of Tiga and a little bit of supercars.
It was a major sporting story, not just motorsport.
Correct.
Story at the time. You have talked a little bit and highlighted kind of mentors for you.
Yes.
I guess Kelvin is clearly one of them.
Absolutely.
You've worked as GM for Scafey with various enterprises that he's involved in, and clearly have a good relationship there. And Gary Connolly, who is so well regarded in global motorsport. Three very different characters. How have they impacted on you, and what are the learnings that have perhaps helped you to this day?
It's probably they're three of a few, to be honest. So I've been very fortunate that I count all of my various people as mentors. There was Graham Fountain, who was the CEO at CAMS, who sort of taught me an element of the way of dealing with things. Obviously, Kelvin's been a huge influence, particularly when it comes to regulation writing and understanding regulations, which is completely his forte. Working with Mark as general manager of his business since the start of 2012, and sharing an office with him even till now. When I'm in Australia, I work out of Mark's office. And Gary, when I first came across him with the Tiga days and working together with him sporadically, there's been Tony Cochrane in a regard, who was chairman of Supercars. There's been Terry Morris in his way, Peter Adderton with his flamboyant style. So for me, there's even with Wayne Caddock as a CEO at Supercars at the time, and just working with all of these various characters, even funny, some people will say, but even the likes of a Gary Rogers, when Gary was on the board for the Tiga board for multiple times, being an uber successful businessman, but having that flamboyance to him in a different regard. And all of them in my formative years, let's call it, have been a huge influence. And then, I go on to, when I did Rally Australia, I was fortunate enough that Ben Rainsford was my chairman there, and all of them at various points, all of us have our strengths and weaknesses. I don't care who you are, everyone has them. And you learn something. I've learned something from each of those people, and still continue to learn from them. The part I think that's a good sign of it is that the majority, well, pretty much all of them, I still keep in contact with, probably not as much as we'd both like in any of them, but we keep in contact, and they've all, probably this is the first time they'd be hearing it, but all of them have had an amazing influence on my life and on my career.
Scafey says, even now, mate, and I'm sure there are days where either the pure hours you have to put in, or the politics, or the strenuous nature of what you're dealing with elite level sport, business, that must take its toll on you. But he says you never lose your passion for motor racing. At the core of it is this just immense love for it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's true. And Mark's probably seen me particularly last year. If you look at the start of it, I was dovetailing in. I did all of the supercar events last year as the deputy race director to Tim Schenken, who, in a race director capacity, is not only an amazing support, a fantastic mentor and teacher, but importantly a friend. So there was last year, and Mark's right, it was a tough year doing all of the supercar events. I did, I think, 7 or 8 Formula One events as the deputy race director to Charlie, and yeah, it has an impact, but each day's a new day, and you strive on. And yeah, I'm very passionate about what I do. I think the part that Mark's probably been quite influential in is the attention to detail, which we can both attest to, and that passionate side of it. right, wrong or indifferent, one part with Mark is that he is one of the most, still to this day, even in business, one of the most passionate, focused individuals that I've ever met. A lot of people only see the public side of Mark, or have ever seen the public side of Mark. But I'm fortunate enough that he, Tony, Mitch, Mia and Tilly, being the family, are amazing friends. And, he is a truly genuine mate that's there at all hours as needed.
That's why he's won so many Bathurst and championships, because he has that attention to detail, that incredible passion to do it at 110%. You have, from my observations, a great trait, Michael, and that is you work collaboratively with people. I don't know anyone who has a bad word to say about you, and at the same time, you're playing in a game that requires conviction. You have to have conviction when it comes to some of those decisions. That's a real tightrope to walk, to keep that garnered respect that you work so hard for, and yet still be strong enough to deliver those things. That's not easy done, but I sense in you that a lot of that is your ability to work with all these diverse characters.
100%. It's if you want a microcosm of the world, working in elite sport, not just motorsport, but elite sport, but be it supercars, previously Formula One now, you've got some not just ultra, but I'd say uber successful businessmen. You've got some of the major corporations in the world, and some amazing athletes. They're not just drivers; they are truly athletes involved. And then you've got the politics that happen behind the scenes, and it's a tough tightrope to walk. I'm not going to deny that. But one of the things that I did I've tried to always do is, work with all the key people, but there's got to be a time where, guess what, you've just got to make a decision, stick to your decision, and be hard, but be fair. And, in the Formula One world this year, it's been a massive learning experience for me, because whilst, you've got all your grounding and everything with what you've done previously, it is to a complete other level, which is, you always know that it is, but until you experience it, it's very hard to describe.
We'll get to some of the aspects of this in a second. I want to finish a little bit of your Australian career before the international stuff with, you've talked a little bit about supercars and working with the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, even the Motorsport Foundation, helping the likes of Scott Pye and Joey Mawson and people like that. Supercars, naturally, is on the CV there. But you've got diversity there as well. You highlighted one of them a moment ago. Even rallying, it's not just circuit racing that is the standout thing on your CV, is it?
No, not just circuit racing. So when I was working for CAMS, so I moved from Supercars as the assistant operations manager for the Supercars Championship, and running at the time what was the Fujitsu series, now the Dunlop Super 2 series, and moved to CAMS in March 2008. Was involved, actually, funnily enough, in the first Singapore Grand Prix in 2008 as a member of the CAMS international training team. But then in late 2008, there was a desire from CAMS to reinvigorate Rally Australia and move it to the East Coast. So I had some friends who I'd grown up with in Western Sydney, in Fairfield, who were working within the government, and I just asked them for who would be the best person to speak to about getting an introduction, because at the time Events New South Wales had just been established, which is now Destination New South Wales, and got to So with remember it clearly, myself, Gary Connolly and Graham Fountain going to Sydney to do a presentation to Events New South Wales about having Rally Australia, because a deal had been done between Australia and New Zealand to share effectively the event on a one year off with Repco sponsorship. And we very quickly came to an arrangement with the New South Wales government and through Events New South Wales at the time to have Rally Australia 2009 in Moolumbar. And so, between the three of us, being myself, Gary and Graham, got that deal across the line. And for the 09 event, I went up to Moolumbar for whatever it was, 2 months, to effectively help run the super special stage at the time, which was the Speed on Tweed course. Yeah. And mutual friend of ours, Rob Van Leeuwen, and I, who had been involved in in rallying, particularly in Western Australia for a number of years, lived together in Kingscliff in a rented house. So it was the odd couple of me doing the cooking and Rob washing the dishes for 2 months.
And you were, am I right in saying you were effectively kind of GM there? You were hands-on with everything in many respects, weren't you?
Yeah, in 09 it was very much still doing my CAMS role, but being up there. And then in 2011, once I came back from the Korean Grand Prix and setting that up, we'll no doubt go into that separately, I moved to Coffs Harbour in 2011 as the CEO of Rally Australia for the first time on the Coffs Coast. So that was an intense 11 months.
Yeah. In that CEO role, were there, did you have to venture off and do other learnings for that side of your skill set, or was it purely that you'd done enough hands-on things over time that you knew what to do in that role? It
was very much had to learn
on the go.
On the go.
Okay.
I had probably some of the key elements that I had learned previously. Some of them I hadn't even realised I had learned, to be quite honest. But again, I was fortunate. I had a fantastic board of Rally Australia to rely upon. So there was, Ben Rainsford was my chairman, Andrew Papadopoulos, the president of CAMS, was on the board, a gentleman by the name of Don Davies, who was a lawyer in Brisbane, who's still on there, who knew how things sort of happened. Stephen Found, who was the representative of the New South Wales government, who owns the theatre at the Star in Sydney, who comes from an entertainment background. Representatives from the Coffs Harbour Council, and it was probably a mixture of everything that I'd learned from all my previous lives that I brought together. But I remember very clearly once I moved up early January and Ben Rainsford, who was the chairman, came up, and his one key criteria as chairman said, I have a no surprise policy, good, bad or indifferent. Tell me as it is, and at least that way we can work together on resolving it. And that's probably something that I've taken forward, with each of the teams that I've worked with, is that it's better to know what's going on than it come back and bite you in a different way of not knowing.
I think that straight talking approach still serves you enormously well to this day. You touched on the international aspects of your career. You mentioned Macau, of course, with super touring, and being here in even Singapore in its formative phase, and with the Confederation of Australian Motorsport helping significantly on the official side for some of the new events that have emerged in Asia. You based yourself in Korea for quite some time too, didn't you, when that event came to be? Was that the real first connection with the likes of Herbie Blash and Charlie Whiting, or if it's not the first, perhaps the point where that connection really became important in your world?
100%, without doubt. So I, on behalf of CAMS, had negotiated the deal with the Korean motorsport governing body, KARA, and with the promoter of the Grand Prix, and to effectively bring a CAMS team of officials.
So you're like a conduit here, basically, are you?
I was at the time. So that was part of my role at CAMS. And I think we brought, in the end, 104 45 odd CAMS officials to the inaugural Korean Grand Prix, which was an amazing feat in itself. But part of my role was effectively the training and the sporting side of it, because whilst Korea had a motorsport history, at that level it wasn't something that they had really experienced. And Joe Chung, who was the president of the ASN at the time, and also quite heavy in the promoter, was an Australian Korean. So he lived at Hampton in Melbourne for 6 months of the year and lived in Seoul for the other 6 months. So did the deal on behalf of CAMS and ultimately moved up there. I think it was May 2010 to help deliver that project. And I said this to a few people after the event, once it was delivered, but there was a lot of rumblings in 2010 that the Korean Grand Prix wasn't going to happen. And I'll be one of those that I'll say in hindsight, neither did I.
Wow.
Got there and the circuit would have best been a off-road jump truck course. Wow. Where it was. And, from just being where I was, I ended up getting roped into project management and everything else. And to touch on the point that you made, it was my first close working relationship with Charlie and Herbie. I'd met them in Melbourne previously. Tim Schenken had introduced me. He was obviously, still is, the clerk of the course for the Australian Grand Prix. So I'd met both of them each of the years. But yeah, the big one was 2010, and I think come about July that year, I was delivering weekly progress reports to Charlie and to the FIA president, Jean Todt, on what was happening at the event, because it was a big one. And, yes, ultimately it happened, but yeah, working with Charlie for all of those, it was a tough time. He was just brilliant to work with.
He was very good to you, I know that, and you did a lot together. Mm-hmm. How did you? What was the first call where he or perhaps it was someone else in the FIA decided to bring you closer to that international family and get you more involved on the international side of the sport, having done so much in Australia and this part of the world?
It's probably a couple of different areas. So part of, in recent years, part of my various contract roles that I'd been doing, part of my CAMS role was to help with the international training and regional training that CAMS were doing either directly or together with the FIA. So I'd been involved in various projects from that side of, be it in delivering regional training in Korea for all of the Asia Pacific governing bodies, to Nepal, and
massive earthquake, I think, when you were there too, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was. The day the earthquake hit, I was presenting. I was actually literally standing up in a room in Kathmandu when the earthquake hit, and FIA President Jean Todt was there with Michelle Yeoh, his partner. Graham Stoker, the FIA Deputy President, was there, and that was, it was an extremely tragic, sad time. One of the, I think, it's the strongest earthquake that Kathmandu, Nepal's ever experienced, and killed thousands of people, sadly. But that was a scary day, that one. So yeah, there was that training, but that training I delivered on behalf of the FIA in various forms, so to speak, and then part of it with my deputy race director role in supercars, and having worked in sort of the race control element for so long in supercars, was that in 2018, start of 18, the FIA ran a FIA race director seminar, which was then coupled with the FIA stewards seminar. So supercars and CAMS agreed for me to go to the race director seminar, together with Tim Schenken, Matt Selly and Chris McMahon, who are two of the supercars permanent chairmen, Trevor Newman, another one of the permanent supercar stewards, and the group of us effectively went over for that at the start of last year, and did that course in Geneva. So
you aren't selling it enough, because I know what you're like, but I'm told you were like top 3 in the world, and then you had to get an endorsement, didn't you? Do 3 events, is that right, to get the kind of rubber stamp? Am I right there?
Yeah, I did quite well in the stewards seminar, and part of that as part of the FIA's international training program. I was one of those that got selected to do 3 different events through 2018, which was, I did the Formula E event in New York, I did Macau, the World Touring Car round last year, and the Formula One trainee in Mexico. So that was...
That's big stage stuff, Michael. I know admittedly on the official side, the spotlight might be on the racetrack and the action happening on the racetrack, but they're very important roles in those events. Did you pause for a moment and take in that you were doing this stuff?
They were certainly pinch yourself moments. I'll be the first one to admit, but that was sort of ultimately the point that led to me being asked to be the deputy last year. Herbie Blash, who was the long-time FIA observer and sat what we now deem as the deputy race director role, is a member of the FIA Volunteers and Officials Commission, and was at that seminar, and Herbie was coming out to Australia a couple of weeks later for the Superbikes event with his role that he does with Yamaha.
He loves the bikes, doesn't he?
He does love the bikes. We joke with him and call him the Yamaha mascot. But no, he's a great friend. He loves the bikes, and Herbie said, I'm coming out to Australia to Phillip Island for the Superbike event. Let's catch up for a bite to eat one night. And it was literally 2 mates catching up for dinner, and he started asking about career aspirations, what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go. And as we both know, that Herbie was probably Charlie's best friend, lifelong friend from when they worked together at Brabham. He employed him at Brabham. And so I said to Herbie straight out, I said, well, it's quite simple. Ultimately, my aspiration, my career goal, as we all have goals of where we want to achieve, is to succeed Charlie. And Herbie's response was very simple. He said, like, cool, let's make that happen. And, in the background, Herbie's been an amazing support even through this year. And so that was sort of, got left at that point, early February, mid to February.
We'd call it seed planted, or it was initial discussion had.
Yeah, initial discussion had. And so from there, the first moment, and I remember it clear as day, was the Wednesday of event week for the Adelaide 500, the supercar event, round 1, sitting, having dinner in Adelaide with Tim Schenken and the stewards that night. And it was about 9 o'clock at night, and my phone rings, and look at it, it's like, Charlie Whiting. It's like, hold on, he's a Barcelona pre-season test. What does he want? So, and was the point of when Charlie had been told that Laurent Mekies, who's now the sporting director at Ferrari, who was the deputy race director, had resigned and was leaving to go to Ferrari. And Charlie said, this is what's happened. I'm going to need a deputy. Would the role be of interest to you? And it's like, well, yes. Don't need to think.
For a millisecond.
A millisecond. Yes, it would be. But part of it was, and I said to him straight away that night, it would be an element of what the FIA would like, because I'd already made a commitment to supercars to be Tim's deputy for the year, and which I highlighted to Charlie. I said, if it's a part-time, trial thing or whatever it might be, then I've made a commitment to supercars. If it's something that the FIA is looking to engage full-time, then I'll have to have some very quick discussions at this end. So that was sort of was like, okay, leave that with me. I know you're effectively around and available. And he said straight out, he said, I was speaking to Herbie and he suggested to ring you. So that was sort of their first part, and probably their biggest frustration that night was having to go back to the dinner table and finish dinner and had to keep my mouth shut. So the only one that I could tell was I rang my mother and let her know. So it was it was sort of a surreal moment the next morning, waking up going, did I just have that conversation? And sort of, when you go through your phone and go, yep, certainly did.
A lot of young people that are perhaps listening to the podcast, Michael, in life now, not everyone, but many young kids are immediacy. They want to get there now. They want to get there fast. There were moments, I think, as you went along this varied path to get to Formula One, where there wasn't always an opening, or the opening might have taken a little bit longer to get to, and things like that. It's also a great lesson in to keep batting, mate, isn't it? Don't give up on that mission. And sometimes if it takes you to the left, so you can come back to the right, that's if you do it right, it's a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the big part for me is being true to yourself, and don't be afraid to take different paths. Yes, we all like the nice straight road, straight pathway to get it done here now immediately. But looking back in hindsight, that it has been a meandering river. It has had its twists and turns and ups and downs and sacrifices along the way, and it's don't give up, I think, is the big part. I've always had, everyone should have a goal, everyone should have an aspiration. Don't be afraid if you don't achieve it immediately, and that's been probably the biggest life lesson for me. And going back to those various mentors that I've discussed earlier, is it just with each of them, it's a never give up attitude. If one door closes, another one opens. If one door's slammed in your face, guess what? Another one will ultimately be opened and welcoming. I don't necessarily take the no for an answer, and try and tried to find different paths to do things, but the one part that I try to continue to achieve is to be me, and continue to try to be the best in myself that I can. And I've said to a lot of people that if what I do is not good enough, one thing I'm going to rest assured of is that I know within myself that I tried and did the best that I could do. And as long as you do the best that you can do, I don't think you should be disappointed. Sometimes those goals may not be achieved immediately, but with some luck stands you in good stead for the future.
The Singapore Grand Prix takes place on the Marina Bay Street Circuit and was the inaugural night race and first street circuit in Asia.
2019 has been a huge year for you. Mm-hmm. It began in very sad circumstances in many respects at Albert Park in Australia. We've talked in the podcast so far about Charlie Whiting, who was an incredible, irreplaceable figure in many respects in Formula One. He had been race director for as long as I can remember. You talked before about him working for Brabham, the race team, back in the day as well. He had this unbelievable ability to, in his race director role and many other roles that he does or did, to garner the respect of everyone in the paddock. You were driving to work on race weekend. You had a great relationship with him, and you had to go to the hotel to pick him up, mate, didn't you? And
No. So what actually happened was we got there, and Charlie's famous words were, if you're on time, you're 5 minutes late. And that was always his adage, that he was always at least 5 minutes early. So we were due to leave the hotel at 7:15 that morning. And it was going to be myself, Chris Bentley and Charlie going in, because we had a stewards teleconference with the 4 permanent chairmen. Effectively, the first briefing of the year. They happen every 4 events. So just getting the 4 chairmen on the phone to discuss what was going to happen. And come I got there about 7:05, waiting in the foyer, and Chris arrived a few minutes later. It's 7:15, and sort of like, we knew that the FIA president was coming to town. I was like, okay, he might have got caught on the phone with Jean being in town. Then sort of 20:07 comes, and it's like, I'll send him a text message, because he was pretty good at responding at those, and knowing he had a read receipt on his messages. So sort of 5 minutes later, that didn't get responded to, so Chris tried to ring him. Phone didn't answer, and the two of us sort of going, there's something not right here. So at that point, we called our doctors, Dr. Ian Roberts and Dr. Elaine Chantigra, who's a FIA medical delegate and FIA deputy medical delegate, and said, something's not right with Charlie, can you come down? We didn't know what it was. And once Elaine and Ian went up there, the first group of us effectively went to the circuit, but I think we all knew in our heart of hearts it wasn't good. And yeah, internally the news came through to us, 10 minutes later, that Charlie had passed in his sleep. And obviously from our end, couldn't say boo to anyone. Not even, outside of our sort of core smaller group that was there when it happened, couldn't say anything even to the rest of the FIA team, until, everyone generally had been advised. How
did you feel, Michael? Because this is among the mentors, another one who played a very significant, part in where you've ended up, mate. Did you have time to process that? Because it would turn out to be a crazily busy weekend for you, and at the same time a huge loss.
Yeah, I was. I probably had a moment when, that morning I literally went and found a corner effectively at Albert Park. There's no one else around, and broke down, and just it was one of those. I actually knew that Mum was in Melbourne, so I called her just to let her know. I said, this is what's happened, and
did she help? Did she say something?
Oh, she was as shocked as any of us. I remember myself and Colin Hayward travelled back with Charlie the night before to the hotel, and saw him in reception. He had we said, right, cool. We'd planned the next day what was going to happen, even planned dinner on the Thursday night. Said, okay, cool. So I sort of left it at that. So everything, it's like, yep, this is what's going to happen in very Charlie fashion. This time we're doing this time we're doing this, and bang, 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 to the point that dinner was methodical. It's like, yep, we're going to this restaurant, we'll leave at this time, there shouldn't be too much happening. So it was like very, very Charlie, organised, structured. And so, but yeah, Mum was is, and huge, amazing support, and I just said, just chill. And yeah, that morning was tough. We even had, team managers coming up because there's certain timeframes of the briefing notes being distributed and elements like that. And team managers sort of coming up in their stroppy, Okay, why haven't we got our notes? What's wrong? And it's like, that was, by that time, 11 o'clock and 11:30 in the morning. And it's like, guys, just, it's been a bit of a delay. Charlie's unwell. And we're just trying to get some few things together. And yeah, it was, I think, give or take, it was about midday that day that the public note of information went out that he had passed. So
I mean, everyone understandably at the Australian Grand Prix that day in Melbourne, everyone was talking about it. How much did he mean to you, and how significant was that passing?
Oh, huge. Like, let's be honest, he ultimately gave me my chance to work in Formula One. End of story. That's, there have been various others that involved in various parts, but he was not only a mentor and gave me my chance, but he was a friend. Like, just sitting there at night chatting about random stuff. Let's be quite honest, it was far from chat about motorsport in the evening. It was, his family, his kids, holidays, what's the latest movies we've watched on planes and all of that. And he was a really humble individual whose work ethic was just undescribable, would be the best way. The scope and amount of work that he did was, even to this day, you sort of go, that's superhuman stuff. Everyone says it, of what it's like in the role that I've done, filling those shoes. And it's quite simple. Those shoes were an individual pair made for one that will never ever be filled. And I actually said this to Charlie a couple of times last year. I said, for me, it's not that, the theme of talking about like in supercars when I was, planned as the successor to Tim. In the discussions I had with Charlie when there was a couple of us sharing the role last year with myself and Scott Elkins, the Formula E race director, I said, Charlie, rest assured, no one will replace Charlie Whiting. It will be a new Formula One race director will be appointed, and the role may be split in various regards, and they will do elements in their own way. But the big part will be that I'm replaceable, and he is irreplaceable. I think even I've read some quotes that Herbie said the same thing, and it's true. So yeah, Melbourne Thursday was Melbourne Thursday, but then the entire weekend, had to sort of sit back on Monday and, is this actually real? And honestly, it took probably a few events saying, well, he really isn't here. The Melbourne weekend was like, oh, okay, he's unwell, he's at the hotel. In the back of your mind, what's forefront, what's going on. But yeah.
You are doing an amazing job, mate, and you, at that time, I would think in his honour, picked it up and ran with it, and you were given the opportunity to be the race director in Melbourne, and I would imagine the days that followed, it's the opportunity that you were striving for, that you would like, but at the same time they were very difficult circumstances to take the reins, and yet it's an honour at the same time, isn't it, knowing that you had to do that for you?
Yeah, Melbourne was, I won't sugarcoat it in any way, shape or form. Melbourne was tough. It was an honour that was completely supported, and it's ironic in some regards how these things happen. We had the FIA president, Jean Todt, was in Melbourne for the Grand Prix this year. The FIA deputy president was in Melbourne. Unplanned, the FIA director of communications was in Melbourne for the Grand Prix. So all of sort of the senior FIA hierarchy, let's call it, who normally would not be at an event, were and were in the country. So, there was the element of thank God that they were there. And come Thursday, myself and Colin Hayward, who is the now Deputy Formula One Race Director, who's been working, I think, he told me the other day, this is Grand Prix number 299 for him working in the FIA, delivered the team managers meeting in Melbourne, and we cobbled together a draft from the previous year's notes within that hour from 12 till 1, and so just went to the team managers meeting. The two of us delivered it and was quite open and said, guys, we need your help. If there's anything missing, whatever, let's just work together to get through this. And all of the team managers, being the sporting directors, were unbelievable, because at that point the president hadn't made a decision on what was going to happen, and that happened late Thursday afternoon when he arrived, because he was in other parts of Australia doing elements with automobile clubs and so forth. So he arrived, and we had he briefed the entire FIA team with all of our contractors, and then we had a further meeting with a smaller group of us, and went through, and Ross Braun, obviously is the Managing Director of Motorsport for F1 Group, was there together with Steve Nielsen, the F1 Sporting Director, and went through and said, this is the plan for the weekend, subject to his approval, where either I would fill the race director role, Colin to fill the deputy function, and Colin's other functions as the race control systems manager. We had some of our contractors from SBG Software and from Riedel that could help with those. And it's like, okay, fine, okay with that. And then the stewards obviously had to make their various changes documentation-wise. And with the president's support, the support of Ross Braun, and we ultimately ended up having Steve Nielsen, the sporting director, sitting there with us at the end, who had been the long-time sporting director at Williams previously, who was sitting there to sort of provide an extra set of hands from a team perspective that weekend, and just having that background. And we got through the weekend, and from that event, that the part that in our team meeting that I said to the entire FIA team on the Sunday morning, I said to them, if this is the only Grand Prix that I do as the race director, one, I couldn't be more proud of the way that they all pulled together, and the way that they all supported each other, but their support of me effectively as the junior. We're talking about people that have done 2, 3, 400 Grands Prix, and there's Michael who did 8 in perspective. So, if this is the only event I do with you, I couldn't be more proud of the way that they did everything. And then, it was come Monday, I'll say I'll be the first, I think all of us did, that the adrenaline stopped, which is what gets you through something like that. And
did you just collapse? How did you feel?
I fell in a heap on the old couch at home, I can tell you. It was, it was, the first moment that I'd sort of had to sit down, process a little bit of it, what had actually occurred. It was, it's a mentally draining time.
We fast forward to Singapore, where you and I are sitting here now. Yep. You are race director and have done for 15 rounds, which is amazing, mate. A lot of learnings in all of that, and then there's been some tough moments along the way. But the common thing people keep telling me is what a great job you are doing, and you have brought a bit of your own moniker to it as well, I think. I mean, the greater presence of the bad sportsman flag is almost a bit of an Australian thing. We have this, you and Craig Baird and others have worked in supercars and had this play-on approach. You've tried to ensure that wherever possible, minimise the stuff that happens in race and try and let the combatants play on, haven't you?
Yeah, I think there's a few elements to that. There was a number of years ago, I think it was 2017, the principle of let them race was the phrase that keeps coming out. And we had a meeting with all of the drivers and the sporting directors in Bahrain after the drivers' meeting to get their understanding for our benefit of what does let them race mean? What is the big ticket items for them? And that was sort of where the pathway started, because I was obviously appointed for Bahrain, but it was a one-off and then continued event by event. But there's the play-on approach. I can't take full credit for it. It's been very much a true partnership between us all. And between us all, I mean from the top at the FIA, being with the president, and then at all levels, including with our stewards, then having, our key partners in the Formula One group, the teams, and the drivers. And, the part of it was trying to find out with the bad sportsmanship flag, the black and white, why it stopped being used. Because whilst we call it, we've been around in Australia, I think most other motorsport people are aware that it's used at all levels. It's used regularly, club all the way through to the World Endurance Championship and others. Even speaking to Anthony Davison, who does the World Endurance Championship, and he said, we use the black and white flag. He said, you'd think that it's a new thing in some areas of the media, but we're that used to seeing it in the WEC. It was sort of trying to work out and getting back to an understanding of why it stopped being used. And then with the support of everyone using it, it's a warning flag. It's one of the tools in a race director toolbox that you have at your disposal. And so after doing all the investigations, we made a decision that from Spa onwards, the first event after the summer break, that we advised the drivers and the teams that we would use it. So all it is, it's actually no different to what's happened before, contrary to what a lot of people think. Previously, it was a one-on-one warning. So we have an intercom system with each of the teams, and with Charlie's reign, or even earlier in the year, this year with me, I used to advise the team directly that that's a warning. Effectively, elbows are too far out, tuck them in. Okay. And all it now is, and I think I heard a comment the other day from someone saying that it's, a more transparent way of doing it, and that was my view of why should it just be a one-on-one warning when everyone can know that we've seen it and that driver's been warned. So it's just a different way of dealing with something we already dealt with, but with a very different outcome, let's call it.
When you arrive at a race weekend, I think in Singapore here, you got on, may have been on Tuesday night or Wednesday before the race that you arrived. It's probably very difficult to say in a handful of words what the race director role is, because you're busy right across the weekend. But if you had to sum it up for someone who wasn't a motor racing person, how would you describe the title, the role? Interesting one. It's multifaceted, to be quite honest. I'm the Formula One race director and the safety delegate. So in the safety delegate capacity, there's the track inspections, looking at the circuit, making sure that all of the safety installations, working with the clerk of the course and the local officials to make sure recovery and all of the trackside marshals, flag marshals and everything is all set, working with our medical delegate and deputy medical delegate to make sure that all the medical side. Probably one way to put it is, at an event, the race director role in a broad sense is
the team manager of the FIA team. But then once you get into the on-track components, the race director role is one of consistency. So you're there to do, effectively, I'll call it the clerk of the course, is the circuit expert and knows their officials. The race director knows the sporting regulations and, dealing with the teams, and is the continuity, is the consistency from one event to the next from a sporting end, to make sure things happen in exactly the same way. So from, it's called ultimate decision to display the red flag and stop a session, to have a safety car intervention, have a virtual safety car intervention, review incidents that might happen on track, not only from if drivers are at, generally, is there something to look at, and then referring that to the stewards to investigate. So contrary to popular belief, the race director role doesn't actually issue any penalties. That is, all penalties are issued and incidents investigated by the stewards. I will review them and suggest that they might have a look at them, but they can absolutely look at them of their own volition at any point in time. So it's a multifaceted role, and then you have the other element of dealing with sporting managers, running a team managers meeting, and dealing with things that happen at the last event, this event, future events, future planning, and then working, running the drivers meeting and getting input from the drivers on various elements as the year has gone on. And, you touched on it earlier, but my approach, and I've said this to a few people, this is Formula One event 15 for me here. And, let's hope I get many, many more to come, but each and every event you learn something new, and I think each and every person learns something new every day in their life, and you keep learning effectively for every day that we're on this earth. And from my view, I've said to the drivers quite openly, let's continue to work together, and I said to the teams, let's continue to work together on achieving what we want. I think the best way of putting it is, a lot of people want grey areas, let's call it, when it comes to driving, the let them race approach, the play on approach, to use the Australian vernacular. So everyone likes that shade of grey until it affects them. Then they want very clear black and white. And I've said this to them all. And I said, so let's work together on defining what that shade of grey is. And, it's just probably my approach generally of trying to work with people. There's a lot of very smart people that have been around a very long time. And for me, it's probably just offering a fresh set of eyes in looking at things in a different perspective and asking the questions of why things aren't done in different ways, just as part of the learning. Some of it you say, okay, cool, fair enough, that makes complete sense. And others you go, okay, are there better ways of doing things?
Well done. There's been some good stuff in the press from senior Formula One people that have spoken glowingly about what you've done. I know you're not one to get excited about pumping your own tyres. But let's, as we go to the finish here, deal with a couple of things. Firstly, best piece of advice I'm sure everyone came to you with advice going into the race director role. What was the best piece of advice, and what's the biggest learning you reckon you've got? I mean, it's one of the top jobs in international motorsport. Huge pressure. You're in the public eye in many respects because you're the umpire, and there's a lot that falls on your shoulders, Mike.
Yeah, there is. Best piece of advice in my career, probably in one part, was that when people try to get to obtain your view on regulations and trying to get interpretations and asking questions in surreptitious ways, let's call it, your initial answer should always be no, because it's far easier to give someone a yes later on down the track once you've had time to study and work out why they want to do something. But the first answer should always be no, and that was from Kelvin. I think that originated from Alan Gow, to be quite honest. So that was a very, very good piece of advice, because it's
Serves you now, probably.
Serves me well now. But yeah, it's far easier to say yes after you've said no rather than going back the other way. Another piece of advice is probably be true to yourself, be yourself. And I've said to my closest mates that I've grown up with, if I change or have changed in any way, feel free to knock me down well and truly as much as necessary. But yeah, just being true to yourself, I think, is the big part. That, you know, there are times that are going to be tough, but, you know, and use everything that you've learnt from all of those various people, mentors, experiences. But ultimately, you're going to do things your own way. And, you know, it is a very big world there. You know, let's not sugarcoat it. It is the premier motorsport competition for me, and I think everyone will agree, in the world. It's competitive. It is big business. It's not just sport. It is huge business. And you've got to try and balance all of that. You know, there's egos involved and all the rest of it, but also being true to, you know, this event here. There's 900 volunteer officials who willingly give up their time. You know, in Australia, there's 1,000 odd volunteer officials at the Grand Prix. Baku, you know, 1,100. And these are all people that, at the other spectrum, willingly give up their time because they are passionate about the sport that I can say here that we all love. And, you know, spending time with each of them and trying, you know, myself and Colin have made a point wherever it's humanly possible to go and thank the officials at their briefings, because without them, what we have here, what we all enjoy, won't happen. So, yeah, I think being true to yourself is probably the biggest one. And yeah, I count myself as extremely fortunate. I have the support of some amazing people all the way through, be it personally and professionally. And without that support mechanism, as a whole, not everything's possible.
John Todd is the top man of the international governing body, the FIA. He's had experience, been very successful in the area of rallying, of course with the Ferrari Formula One team, and now in an administrative capacity. What's your relationship with him like? And do you get daunted when the boss rings on the phone?
I'll be honest. At first, yes. Let's be quite clear. In Melbourne, I obviously met John a number of times through the various FIA training and that I delivered. But in Melbourne, and considering the circumstances, yes, it was daunting. And I'll be the first to admit that. And daunting at some of the subsequent events. And, you know, quite openly, I was effectively in a trial period up until the summer break, which, putting his hat on, completely support, because you've got to see how someone who you don't really know operates in these different circumstances and performs and has the different challenges that might be thrown at them. But my relationship with the president is great. He's been hugely supportive, particularly as the years gone on. We've got to know each other more, both professionally and personally. And, you know, when he comes into race control and sits there, be it for a few minutes or whatever, just to see what's going on, he's very much the first. If there's something that he doesn't like or doesn't understand, he'll ask you personally. He won't just go out there. He'll say, can you explain this to me, of why? On the other front is very much the first to say, come up and say, well done. And, you know, he's been a huge supporter. If there's questions or things that he'd like investigate it or to get a better understanding of. He's been there, and without, I'll be very honest, without his support, but probably the broader part that everyone misses is that at a Formula One event within the FIA side, I'm just one piece of the puzzle. The team that I have around me, I've got an amazing team. We all do everything together, be it the technical team, ultimately led by Nicholas Tambassis as the head of technical matters, but then at an event through Joe Bauer and that side of it, to the sporting team that effectively I lead with Colin and Chris and Christian, and then the press and media team with Olivia and Tom, and there's all of those various elements, and I'm just one cog in that puzzle. It's not a one-man show, and I think that's the part that, yes, ultimately at an event it was made very clear and fair enough, the buck stops with me. If there's any questions or whatever, however, I couldn't do it without each and every one of them, and that's been since day one. I've been fortunate enough to have Colin Hayward sitting by my side, who has been sitting in race control all of those years, who knows how things happen. Chris in the office, Christian Brill, who's now the permanent starter, who's been around, and then words of advice from the likes of Herbie, who does a welfare check, let's call it, every couple of weeks to see how things are going. And, I just count myself as privileged to work with an amazing group of people, even with the broader Formula 2, Formula 3 team of staff that come to the European, a lot of the events where those events are at. Rome wasn't built in a day, as the adage goes, and, it's not a one-man show. That's probably for me the biggest part that John has realised and appreciated, of how many different pieces there are and the way that we all do work together as a team.
Charlie did so much, mate, and was involved in so many things. The focus for you right now is the immediate, the race director role, and just I think you're probably living in the now in that sense and making sure that is the focus. What about the beyond this? Have you thought long term? I mean, will you have to, currently I think you still reside in Melbourne and you come and go, and will you have to move to Europe and things like that?
At the moment I've got my roles confirmed through to the end of the year. Beyond that, we'll see what happens. But, if it were to continue, there's no doubt I'll have to relocate to Europe. That's a given. It's, whilst I love Australia, all of my family and friends are there, it takes its toll travelling, 26 hours each way for a lot of the events. And, at the end of the day, the operational hub of everything is Europe. The first part of the year and the back part of the year, has its back-to-backs and so forth involved, and, 22 events next year. Who knows what that's going to increase to beyond that. So, ultimately, if things continue, we'll have to move, but we'll worry about that step when we get there. But it is, it's very much living in the now, from the perspective of, I've got a job to do. I'll continue to do the best role that I can, and continue to work with everyone to make sure come Abu Dhabi Sunday night, when that checkered flag drops and the final results are signed off by the stewards, that we can all look back and go, you know what? Let's have a quiet drink to say very well done. And thanks to Charlie upstairs, who's been overseeing us as the guardian angel all year. But well done to everyone in the team collectively for what they've achieved in, a very tough set of circumstances that's had a huge number of challenges thrown at us throughout the year.
Final one. Is there a little resto project, maybe in later life, and a little car. I don't know what it might be, a Alpha that you're inspired by from the days with Rudy. Is there a little something like that one day you might like to do? And you've got no time to do it at the moment. I know that's the key thing.
One day when let's call it much older and I can't say very grey because, as you know, I'm greying rapidly. I'm trying to catch up. I'm trying to catch up to you. People will laugh. A Mini Cooper S.
Is that right? And is it a particular year, a particular style? What have you got your heart set on?
Old Mini Cooper S in the vermilion red with the white roof. Just always liked minis.
Beautiful. Congratulations, mate. It's a great story that's been an honour to sit and to share. I think for people that have aspirations in motorsport, you're a reminder that it doesn't just have to be about the engineering or the driving side. There is so much more to it than that. I owe you a lunch after this, but Scapey's reminded me you don't mind, a nice French or Italian meal, but he says you've probably still got your first dollar. You're not big on pulling out the wallet to pay for it. Is that right?
Coming from him, that's a big call. One would suggest Sir Lunchalot himself. And no, I can definitely say that I'm more than happy to shout a good lunch. I do enjoy good food. So, no, whilst yes, don't get wrong, I enjoy spending money on nice things. Do I say that I throw things away? No. But no, we all enjoy good food and good wine, but it's a bit rich coming from Sir Lunchalot.
Top job. You're doing a lot of great stuff, and keep powering. Thank you.
Thanks for the time, and good to see an old mate in a different country.
Rusty's Garage is written and presented by me, Greg Rust. Series producer and editor is Alex Mitchell. Audio production by Darcy Thompson.
Listener.